If I asked you to name the first millionaire in history, who pops into your head? You would probably guess someone like John D. Rockefeller with his oil monopoly, or maybe a king from the 18th century draped in velvet. Maybe you are a bit of a history buff, and you are screaming Musa Musa at your screen right now. But what if I told you the world's first true millionaire lived in a world where money literally did not exist? Think about that for a second. They did not have gold coins jingling in a leather pouch. They did not have offshore bank accounts, diversified stock portfolios, or a ridiculous obsession with flying rockets to Mars. But they had something far, far more dangerous: a surplus. By the end of this video, we aren't just going to identify who this shadowy prehistoric person was. We are going to uncover how they single-handedly invented the concept of inequality, and why, 10,000 years later, you, me, and everyone watching this are still playing by their exact same rules. We are conditioned to think of wealth as cash. We imagine digits on a screen, vaults filled with paper, or a fancy piece of plastic in our wallets. But to understand the true, raw origin of wealth, we have to strip all of that modern illusion away. Let me ask you a question. If the entire global financial grid collapsed tomorrow, what would your bank account be worth? Exactly zero. In the year 800 BCE, wealth was not a concept of currency. Wealth was calories. Think of wealth simply as stored energy. Today, you go to work, you expend energy, and you store the reward for that energy in dollars so you can spend it later on a pizza or a new pair of shoes. But thousands of years ago, if you were the first person to successfully control the calorie surplus of your entire tribe, you were effectively the first billionaire on Earth. The word millionaire is just a modern label for a very ancient, very primal phenomenon. It is not about the actual currency you hold. It is about leverage. It is about control. When you have more stored energy than the people around you, you have absolute, unquestionable power over them. Have you ever tried to negotiate with someone when you are starving and they have a sandwich? It is not a negotiation. It is a surrender. That dynamic is the bedrock of human economics. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived exclusively as hunter-gatherers. In those ancient, nomadic societies, the very concept of being wealthy was literally impossible. Hunting and gathering was strictly, ruthlessly egalitarian. There was no first millionaire back then for one simple, frustrating biological reason. You could not store meat. It rotted. Imagine your hunting party brings down a massive, 6-ton woolly mammoth. What are you going to do? Put it in your prehistoric freezer? Tell the rest of the tribe that you killed this, so you are taking 80% of it, and they can have the scraps? No. If you didn't eat it, the flies did. You had to share it with everyone immediately. You could not hoard it. And because you could not hoard it, nobody could hold power over anyone else by withholding food. Everyone was equal because nature forced them to be. Let me ask you this. How long could you survive right now if your refrigerator vanished and you could only eat what you could forage in your neighborhood? Probably not long, unless you really like eating dandelions. But then, around 10,000 years ago, a massive, unprecedented shift happened in the Fertile Crescent: the invention of grain storage. The Neolithic Revolution. This was the pivot that changed human history forever. Suddenly, a few clever individuals realized that if they gathered wild wheat, barley, and lentils, they could dry them out, put them in a dark, dry pit, and they would not rot for months, maybe even years. For the first time in the history of our species, humans could hoard calories. They could store energy for the winter. The person who controlled that first grain silo was our prehistoric Jeff Bezos. They didn't have $1 million, but they had 1 million calories. And with that single, seemingly harmless agricultural invention, the perfectly equal world of our hunter-gatherer ancestors shattered overnight. If winter came and crops failed, who did the tribe go to? The guy with the grain pit. And you can bet he didn't just give it away out of the goodness of his heart. He wanted something in return: labor, loyalty, land. Once survival was guaranteed by the grain silo, human ambition did not just stop. When has it ever? Humans started looking for other things to hoard, and this created the first bankers and merchants of the ancient world. But they did not trade in gold or silver. They traded in stone, specifically obsidian and high-quality flint. In a world before bronze or iron were even a thought, obsidian was the ultimate cutting-edge technology. Literally, it is a volcanic glass that can be fractured to an edge thinner than a modern surgical scalpel. Obsidian was the smartphone of 8000 BCE. Everyone wanted it, but only a few people knew where to get it. If you controlled the rare obsidian mines in places like ancient Anatolia, or you controlled the trade routes that moved it across the ancient landscape, you controlled the tools that built society. You controlled the weapons that defended it. These early merchants in ancient mega-settlements became the first true hoarders of social capital. They did not just store grain, they stored status. They traded shiny black rocks for massive amounts of food, animal skins, labor, and prestige. But there is a massive, terrifying trap here. The moment you store wealth, you create a target on your own back. Think about it. If you are the only family in a village of 500 people, with a massive pit of grain and a pile of razor-sharp obsidian, what happens when everyone else gets hungry? What happens when human envy kicks in? How did the first millionaire survive the inevitable envy of their hungry, armed neighbors? They couldn't just fight everyone off themselves. They had to invent something completely new, something that would shape the rest of human history. They had to invent armed guards. They took some of their surplus food and used it to pay the biggest, strongest guys in the tribe to stand outside their grain pit with pointy sticks. The prehistoric thug had officially evolved into the prehistoric security guard. Next, they had to invent fortified walls to put between their wealth and the poor. And finally, they had to invent the concept of a ruling class. They had to weave stories, myths, and early religions to convince the rest of the tribe that the gods themselves wanted them to be wealthy and that they inherently deserved to have more. Let us fast forward from those shadowy figures of prehistory to the glaring light of recorded history. Because to truly understand how this ancient hoarding evolved into modern, hyper-aggressive wealth, we have to look at the people who perfected the game. First, a quick honorable mention to King Croesus of Lydia in the 6th century BCE, who is credited with inventing the first standardized gold and silver coins. He gave us the phrase rich as Croesus. But Croesus was a king. He inherited power. To find our true first self-made, cutthroat capitalist millionaire, we have to look at Rome. We have to look at Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was a Roman general and politician in the 1st century BCE, and he is the absolute classic archetype of the billionaire tycoon. He was arguably the wealthiest man in Roman history, and he was the first prominent figure to use money to make more money in a ruthlessly systematic way. Crassus was essentially the original slumlord, but his most famous and most evil invention was the first fire brigade in Rome. Now, you might be thinking, a fire brigade? That sounds nice. What a great guy. Hold on. There was a massive, terrible catch. When a building caught fire in ancient Rome, his private army of 500 trained firefighters would rush to the scene, but they would not throw a single drop of water on the flames. Instead, Crassus would step up to the desperate, crying owner and offer to buy the burning property on the spot for a tiny fraction of its actual value. If the owner said, "Are you crazy? Put it out," Crassus simply stood there, crossed his arms, and let the building burn to the ground. Once it was ashes, he would buy the scorched earth for pennies anyway. If the owner agreed to sell, then the firefighters would save the structure, and Crassus would add another property to his massive empire. It is literally the worst insurance policy in human history. Crassus took the primitive hoarding of the Stone Age and weaponized it into an industry. But if we look closely, if we strip away the Roman togas and the ancient animal skins, are the Neolithic grain hoarder and the Roman real estate capitalist really that different? Absolutely not. The mechanism never changed. You leverage a surplus to exploit a deficit. You use what you have to squeeze the people who have nothing. By the way, his obsession with wealth had a rather ironic ending. He eventually led a disastrous military campaign against the Parthian Empire because he wanted military glory to match his money. He was captured, and legend has it the Parthians executed him by pouring molten gold down his throat, a very literal punishment for his unquenchable thirst for wealth. Talk about a tough pill to swallow. So, who was the very first millionaire? The reveal might disappoint those of you looking for a specific name carved into a dusty clay tablet in a museum. The truth is far more profound and a little bit uncomfortable. The first millionaire was not a person. It was a decision. It was a psychological shift. That happened the very first time a human being looked at a massive surplus of food, looked at their community, and decided to prioritize having more over being together. It was the exact moment. Someone pointed at a pile of resources and said, "This is mine, not ours." And why does this matter to us today? As we scroll through social media looking at billionaires buying super yachts that have their own smaller super yachts inside them, because our endless modern obsession with being the first, the richest, the most successful, and the most heavily armed with cash is actually just our ancient, primal fear of being the last. Deep down in our neurology, we are all still running from the fear of an empty grain silo in the dead of winter. The suits are nicer, the technology is faster, and the numbers have more zeros, But make no mistake, we are still playing the exact same game that began 10,000 years ago, just with much flashier scoreboards. We have only scratched the surface of this massive, hidden history. If you want to know how this ancient inequality influenced the very first laws ever written, like the Code of Hammurabi, and how those ancient laws still secretly govern your banking, your real estate, and your daily life today, you need to watch this video next. But before you go, I have a question for you. Which ancient invention do you think ruined society more? The invention of money, or the invention of the calendar, which forced us to track time and work every single day? Drop a comment below. I am reading all of them. I'll see you in the next one.